I'm David Flint, and this is Australia Calling. And the topic of the program today is AUKUS, the new alliance between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And for this, we can have no better person to comment than Gregory Copley, who's the renowned Washington-based geostrategist and extraordinary best-selling author, which is a marvelous combination. And he will give us the benefit of his understanding of this new alliance. Gregory.
Great to be with you, David. The alliance is a turning point, I think, in evolving the new Indo-Pacific and global strategies for the United States, for Australia, and for Britain. It really gets rid of some of the inefficiencies which we've seen in recent years in the Five Eyes relationship between the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Canada and New Zealand have been, if you like, lagging a little bit in their common thought with the rest of the Five Eyes. So this actually consolidates three major countries with like defense and strategic interests, particularly in the containment of the People's Republic of China. So that's where it's starting. I know that the media has dwelt largely and almost exclusively on the fact that Australia, under this new arrangement, will acquire nuclear submarines or nuclear submarine technology from either the United States or the United Kingdom, or a bit from each. But the reality is it's much more serious than that. It does look at much more technology sharing of a strategic nature, more detailed intelligence sharing, more so than the Five Eyes Agreement, and it does allow for a greater coordination at policy levels. Now, there's still a lot to be sorted out from this agreement. The reality is that it began literally to take shape in March of 2021. It was solidified on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Cornwall in June this year, and subsequently was announced just in latter days. The problem was that in order to maintain the secrecy of this new alliance, which was bound to be controversial, was that it risked the alienation of some other allies, particularly France, and possibly others like India. But France took great umbrage, and with some justification, that the deal was announced as a submarine deal, which is only an operational aspect of it, but it was announced as a submarine deal which would cause the Australian agreement to buy French submarines to be discarded. And yes, that was true. So the French were, in a sense, rightly offended and humiliated by the sudden announcement that the Americans or the British would be providing these submarines. As a result, Paris took great offence at Britain and the United States as well as Australia, which I think is going to hurt French interests. But the reality is that the French should have seen this coming. They should have seen the fact that the submarine which they had, quote, sold to the Australians under the previous government, Australian government, was not working out. It had basically resulted in a contract which should have been worth about 12 billion US dollars, ballooning out to something which was now projected to cost about 180 billion US dollars, and yet would not see this new French-designed submarine enter Australian service for at least 20 years. This is absolutely unacceptable in either economic, political, or strategic terms, because we don't know what the strategic environment is going to be like in 20 years' time. And yet the French persisted in this, and knowing that this was a great rip-off of Australian taxpayer money for a product which didn't exist. Certainly the French were not solely to blame. The previous Australian government of Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister, and Christopher Pyne, the then Defence Minister, was very much to blame, along with some of the Australian admirals. And as I say, while the French should have been busy cutting their wrists as a form of apology for having attempted to steal so much money from Australia, so the Australians should have been resurrecting the yard arms on their ships to hang a few recalcitrant admirals and politicians from it. But the deed has been done, and now Australia moves into a new era, and so does Britain and the United States. In a sense...
Greg, just if I could interrupt you on that, this really is the culmination of 40 years of doing the same sort of thing, because Labour, before the Liberals, did something just as ridiculous in going to a neutral power and trying to get them to not just sell us their submarine, the Swedes, but to adapt it to Australian needs and build it in Australia.
Well, yes and no. I think that was a decision taken by Kim Beazley when he was Defence Minister, and I think it was in fact a very good decision because it meant that Australia got better than any other nation's conventional submarines. We got a very, very good conventional submarine, the Cockham's 471 type, and then adapted it with US fire control systems and other advances, and made a submarine which was better than almost anything else available at the time. So we got a very good submarine, but we paid an enormous price for it, largely because the Australian government insisted on building a new corporation, Australian Submarine Corporation, now ASC, to build it. And ASC built regardless of cost. So the Collins class submarine, as it turned out to be called, was very good, but wildly expensive. And it took a long time after it entered service to be brought to the peak of its efficiency. Now, of course, the Collins class is going to go through a service life extension program, which is going to be necessary to keep it in service for a lot longer. But it's critical that these submarines stay there, because if Australia is now to get nuclear-powered submarines, which have a very great capability in certain mission profiles, we also still need the capacity of a conventional submarine, a diesel-electric submarine, because these have a lower signature, give off lower emissions. So they're much easier to disguise in the shallow waters around the Southeast Asian nations. So getting up through the Indonesian and South China Sea waterways is much easier to do with a smaller conventional submarine like the Collins. So once we go to nuclear vessels, we will lose some of that ability, but we'll gain other capabilities.
Should we have disguised the fact as to whether these will carry nuclear weapons?
Not really, because nuclear weapons are so 20th century. They have become eclipsed by newer technologies. We don't need the massive costs, not only of creating but maintaining nuclear weapons, when other weapons can do the strategic mission so much more effectively. And those other weapons are largely built around cyber and space-based weapons, and to some degree, if you're looking at kinetic weapons, by hypersonic weapons, where you can use the kinetic impact of non-nuclear cyber weapons to take out key targets. The reality is that very few wars are won by the destruction of mass urban populations. Yes, that can cause grave humanitarian and economic problems for the target country, but the reality is that's not a war-winning strategy. In fact, you look at the atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these did not win World War II for the West. They did highlight, if you like, the psychological superiority of Western technology over anything that Japan or the Soviet Union had at the time, although the Soviet Union was quick to catch up. But the reality was that it didn't win the war. The Japanese had already seen the writing on the wall that the war was over. This shortened the war. It meant that...
Could I just interrupt on that and take you on a slight detour? What should Truman have done, do you think?
Well, Truman did absolutely the right thing by using the nuclear weapons to signal to the Soviets that the US had entered the Japanese homeland and was going to dominate the post-war Japanese society. So that was very effective, and it was salutary in setting the tone for the post-World War II Cold War, and it said those terms in favor of the West. Now, what Truman, I think, should also have done was to have been more delicate in how he handled the post-surrender Japanese government. One thing which several colleagues of mine assisted with was the retention of the Japanese imperial monarchy to maintain a sense of continuity over post-war Japan. That was critical to a sense of dignity and identity for the Japanese people, and stopped, if you like, the mass hysteria which would have accompanied any lack of a central Japanese authority figure. You would have seen then the rise of Japanese socialism, which would have been exploited enormously by the Soviet Union. Now, I think the US went too far in insisting on the destruction of the Japanese aristocracy, because that provided, if you like, a stabilizing force in the country to provide a sense of history, continuity, and again, dignity and identity. So,
yes, on that, could I bring you back to the subject? And obviously, the President of the United States gained some benefit from this, because it shows to the world that he is seriously concerned about allies after what happened in Afghanistan. That is the message, I think, that is coming out. But what other advantages are there for the United States in the Australian and the confirmation of the British connection?
Well, in one sense, it got President Biden and the United States a little bit off the hook in the Indo-Pacific. It put more of the responsibility on Australia and Britain in that region, and allowed the United States to take a step backwards from undisputed premier power in the Indo-Pacific to now being primus inter pares, first among equals in this alliance. Yes, of course, the US will have to be deferred to in some areas, but the reality is Australia has to do more, Britain has to do more, and the United States essentially invited Britain to become once again a great maritime power in the Indo-Pacific, in a way in which the United Kingdom does not have to compete with the United States. So we're seeing this.
Yes, on this you might remember that one of the reasons, the principal reason, that de Gaulle first vetoed British entry into the common market was because Britain had this world vocation, it was the world view, and she wasn't really a European power. Has she then been returned to being a world power?
Yes, and and Brexit, the removal of Britain from the European Union, meant that the United Kingdom had only one way to go if it wished to return to being a prosperous sovereign power, and that was to become a world trading power again. Britain, as a small island nation, has to be a global trader in order to succeed. And in order for Britain to get back into the position of being a preferred trading partner for many countries around the world, it had to be seen to have prestige and power projection and influence around the world. And that meant using its great ability to show the flag globally. The United Kingdom is about to join Australia and New Zealand and others in the new Pacific Trading Compact, and it's going to join as an inconceivable for Britain to do as a member of the European Union, quite clearly. Britain is now starting to enjoy the fruits of Brexit. Its international trading position has increased enormously already in less than a year after the Brexit was finally achieved. Its trade, even with the European Union member states, has improved dramatically. So Britain is now moving this global return to global Britain back onto a large scale. And the creation of the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement is a part of that. And of course, can lead to much more, not just to Britain joining the Pacific Trading Partnership, but also to the creation in the longer term, as we are seeing evolving already, of the CANZUK bloc, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, where we have those four countries, which are essentially all of like culture. They all are essentially British in their structures. They have a common head of state, common parliamentary system, common legal system, a common approach to defence. They have full intelligence sharing, and as they come back into focus, what that delivers is a block of countries which have territories in the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, the North Pacific, the South Pacific, the Mediterranean, Arctic territories, Antarctic territories. This is a true global force. And to a degree, the United States is buying into that when it supports, if you like, the tripartite AUKUS alliance, because that becomes then a heart of that capability. Now, if you're members of other alliances with the United States and with Australia or with the United Kingdom, there may be some pause that they're being left aside. Some NATO states, for example, see the AUKUS arrangement as being isolating to them. France feels isolated. The European Union feels isolated. The European Union spokesman was saying things like, well, we were never consulted about the creation of this new AUKUS alliance. Well, why should they be? Frankly, the European Union has become increasingly less important to...
Well, we were never consulted about the pipeline from Germany to the former Soviet Union, for example. It was a matter for them.
And we were never consulted in Australia about Britain joining the European Union. We lost our major trading partner at that time. And so the Europeans have threatened that they could veto the EU-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Well, that would be unfortunate, but it would be a great loss for the European Union and not that much of a loss for Australia. The Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement and the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement are already the critical underpinnings of increasingly important when we look to the world after the collapse of the People's Republic of China.
Do you expect that?
I expect that, and it is occurring even as we speak. We are seeing the People's Republic of China move back to what they are calling an internal circulation economy. They're withdrawing from the world. They are abandoning their experiment with post-Mao capitalism under Deng Xiaoping. That is being abolished. And even in the past month or so, we've seen the Xi Jinping administration willfully remove about $3 trillion in value from the Beijing and Shanghai stock exchanges. We're seeing the willful cooperation of the Communist Party of China in allowing major capitalist or free market entities such as larger real estate developers go into foreclosure or collapse, which will absolutely destroy much of the momentum for private wealth in China.
Just on China, communist China, what impact will AUKUS have on their plans? So just say, for example, they were planning aggression against Taiwan. Would you see this as a constraining factor in relation to that?
There is no question that the new AUKUS alliance bolsters the security of the Republic of China because it gives a greater capability for movement against the People's Republic of China in a military sense. In fact,
nice to hear Taiwan referred to as the Republic of China.
Indeed, and in fact, even the present government of the Republic of China has been favouring the use of the word Taiwan just because they need to differentiate themselves from the People's Republic of China, Communist China. But what we have to be careful is to ensure that the creation of AUKUS does not in any way compromise the other and highly valuable instruments in containing the PRC at this stage, namely the Quad alliance of the US, Japan, India, and Australia, because it's critical that that Beijing understands that any war against the Republic of China, Taiwan, would automatically engage the military response of Japan, and that in turn would order military option of the United States.
Just on that, then, has AUKUS had a deleterious effect on, I suppose Japan is always going to be there as a potential enemy of the People's Republic, but what impact has it had on India?
Well, the Indian government has very, very interestingly not commented in any meaningful fashion on the creation of AUKUS, but New Delhi must be aware that this is also a counterweight in the longer term, in the post-China, post-PRC sense, to the emergence of India as a great power. The removal of the United States from any meaningful influence in Central Asia because of the way it abandoned Afghanistan, and I stress the way it abandoned Afghanistan, means that India is now free to move towards and into Central Asia. That particular August 2021 collapse of US credibility in Afghanistan has been the greatest gift that could have been given to Moscow. It enabled Moscow to start to rebuild its influence over the former Russian Empire in Central Asia, the key five Central Asian states who were hoping to get access to the global markets without going. Once again, they have to, if you like, pay some respect to Moscow. Moscow will be very different in how it handles that than it was in the past. We will see the Commonwealth of Independent States and the Moscow's relationship with the five-state Central Asian bloc being very, very friendly, benign, and Moscow is very much aware that it cannot be, if you like, a superpower on top of those Central Asian states. Nonetheless,
Could I ask you, Greg, one final question in this very interesting area? We have in Australia a peculiar policy, and that is there is a complete prohibition, which was supported by both parties, of a domestic nuclear industry, although we're sitting on an enormous amount of uranium centered around the world, but we forbid the development of a domestic industry. Do you think that this will make a domestic nuclear industry inevitable?
in a word, yes. We have to remember that Australia was one of the three major participants in the West's atomic weapons program in World War II. Australia, after World War II, opted out of that nuclear arrangement, but during World War II, we provided a lot of the thinking on atomic science to the United States and the United Kingdom. We provided, of course, a lot of the original uranium for the Allied victory in World War II with the atomic weapons. But if we are going to have nuclear-powered warships based in Australia, arguably built in the long run in Australia, then we will need to have a nuclear power industry to support that. Initially, we will not be having nuclear warships of our own, I would argue, based in HMAS Stirling near Fremantle in Western Australia. We will probably lease one or two nuclear-powered submarines from either the United Kingdom or the United States, or arguably one or two from each in the long run. But then we will be building our own vessels. Now, to support the leased vessels, we will need to have a nuclear industry capable of understanding the technologies of reactors and the like. If we then build our own nuclear-powered submarines, attack submarines, we will then have to have a nuclear power industry capable of supporting that. Now, I think the government has been very cautious in how it's announced this. In fact, Prime Minister Morrison said that this was not going to be the precursor to establishing a nuclear power industry in Australia. But of course it is and must be. And Australia needs to bite that bullet sooner rather than later if it's to get some freedom to provide low-cost electricity to Australian households. It has allowed its oil and gas, particularly its oil industry, to wither on the vine. We haven't exploited our own petroleum reserves, which are trapped in shale-like rock formations, largely in South Australia. And we have lost much of our petrol refining capability. So if we're going to move to a new generation of low-cost energy, it will either be through our own natural gas utilization or through nuclear power. And arguably, as we can sell our natural gas at good money to foreign customers, the best thing to do is to keep selling that and to use as little as possible of it for our domestic power industry, provided we have other sources of electric power generation. And that can only be nuclear, because it's demonstrable that solar and wind and even tidal-based energy generation cannot ever compensate for the volume of energy which we now need for Australia to prosper in the future.
Well, thank you for those very wise words. This has been Australia Calling, and we've heard the very interesting and wise comments of our friend Greg Copley, who's a very well-renowned Washington-based geostrategist and very much a great bestseller. So thank you.
Thank you.